This is a CBS News Special Report. I'm Anthony Mason reporting from CBS News headquarters in New York. Good day. President Trump just finished an extraordinary news conference at Trump Tower here in New York. It was about as angry and contentious as we've seen him since he took office, as he took questions about the violence in Charlottesville, Virginia. Here was the president just minutes ago when he was asked about how Senator John McCain characterized the events this past weekend in Charlottesville.
Defend your National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, against
I've
all
already
these
done
attacks.
it. I did it the last time.
And he called on it again, linking this
Senator
to
McCain?
the alt-right. And
Senator McCain, you mean the one who voted against Obamacare?
And he said
who is Senator? You mean Senator McCain who voted against us getting good health care?
McCain said that the alt-right is behind these attacks, and he linked that same group to those who perpetrated the attack in Charlottesville.
Well, I don't know. I can't tell you. I'm sure Senator McCain must know what he's talking about. But when you say the alt-right, define alt-right to me. You define it. Go ahead.
Well, I'm saying,
define it for me. Come on, let's go.
Senator McCain defined them as the same group.
Okay, what about the alt-left that came charging at him? Excuse me. What about the alt-left that came charging at the, as you say, the alt-right? Do they have any semblance of guilt?
This is Senator McCain's
let me ask you this. What about the fact they came charging with clubs in their hands, swinging clubs? Do they have any problem? I think they do. So, as far as I'm concerned, that was a horrible, horrible day. Wait a minute. I'm not finished. I'm not finished, fake news. That was a horrible day. I will tell you something. I watched those very closely, much more closely than you people watched it. And you have you had a group on one side that was bad, and you had a group on the other side that was also very violent. And nobody wants to say that, but I'll say it right now. You had a group on the other side that came charging in without a permit, and they were very, very violent. Go ahead.
Do you think that what you call the alt-left is the same as neo-Nazis?
Those people, all of those people, excuse me, I've condemned neo-Nazis. I've condemned many different groups, but not all of those people were neo-Nazis, believe me. Not all of those people were white supremacists by any stretch. Those people were also there because they wanted to protest the taking down of a statue, Robert E. Lee. So, excuse me, and you take a look at some of the groups and you see, and you know it if you were honest reporters, which in many cases you're not, but many of those people were there to protest the taking down of the statue of Robert E. Lee. So, this week it's Robert E. Lee. I noticed that Stonewall Jackson's coming down. I wonder, is it George Washington next week, and is it Thomas Jefferson the week after? You know, you really do have to ask yourself, where does it stop? But they were there to protest, excuse me, you take a look the night before, they were there to protest the taking down of the statue of Robert E. Lee. Infrastructure question, go ahead.
Should statues of Robert E. Lee stay up?
I would say that's up to a local town, community, or the federal government, depending on where it is located.
Are you against the Confederacy?
How concerned are you about race relations in America? And do you think things have gotten worse or better since you took office?
I think they've gotten better or the same. Look, they've been frayed for a long time. And you can ask President Obama about that because he'd make speeches about it. But I believe that the fact that I brought in, it will be soon, millions of jobs. You see where companies are moving back into our country. I think that's going to have a tremendous positive impact on race relations. We have companies coming back into our country. We have 2 car companies that just announced. We have Foxconn in Wisconsin just announced. We have many companies, I say, pouring back into the country. I think that's going to have a huge positive impact on race relations. You know why? It's jobs. What people want now, they want jobs. They want great jobs with good pay. And when they have that, you watch how race relations will be. And I'll tell you, we're spending a lot of money on the inner cities. We're fixing the inner cities. We're doing far more than anybody's done with respect to the inner cities. It's a priority for me, and it's very important.
Mr. President, are you putting what you're calling the alt-left and white supremacists on the same moral plane?
I'm not putting anybody on a moral plane. What I'm saying is this. You had a group on one side and you had a group on the other, and they came at each other with clubs, and it was vicious, and it was horrible, and it was a horrible thing to watch. But there is another side. There was a group on this side, you can call them the left, or you've just called them the left, that came violently attacking the other group. So you can say what you want, but that's the way it is.
On both sides, sir, you said there was hatred, there was violence on both sides.
Well, I do think there's blame. Yes, I think there's blame on both sides. You look at both sides. I think there's blame on both sides, and I have no doubt about it, and you don't have any doubt about it either. And if you reported it accurately, you would say.
Kill the person. Heather hired
Charlottesville. They showed up in Charlottesville to protest.
Excuse me. They didn't put themselves down as you. And you had some very bad people in that group. But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides. You had people in that group, excuse me, I saw the same pictures as you did. You had people in that group that were there to protest the taking down of, to them, a very, very important statue and the renaming of a park from Robert E. Lee to another name. No, George Washington was a slave owner. Was George Washington a slave owner? So will George Washington now lose his status? Are we going to take down, excuse me, are we going to take down statues to George Washington? How about Thomas Jefferson? What do you think of Thomas Jefferson? You like him? Okay, good. Are we going to take down the statue? Because he was a major slave owner. Now we're going to take down his statue. So you know what? It's fine. You're changing history, you're changing culture, and you had people, and I'm not talking about the neo-Nazis and the white nationalists, because they should be condemned totally. But you had many people in that group other than neo-Nazis and white nationalists, okay? And the press has treated them absolutely unfairly. Now, in the other group also, you had some fine people, but you also had troublemakers, and you see them come with the black outfits and with the helmets and with the baseball bats. You had a lot of bad people in the other group too.
Who was treated unfairly, sir? I'm sorry, I just didn't understand what you were saying. You were saying the press has treated white nationalists unfairly?
No,
I just didn't understand what you were saying.
No. There were people in that rally, and I looked the night before. If you look, there were people protesting very quietly the taking down of the statue of Robert E. Lee. I'm sure in that group there were some bad ones. The following day, it looked like they had some rough, bad people, neo-Nazis, white nationalists, whatever you want to call them. But you had a lot of people in that group that were there to innocently protest and very legally protest because, you know, I don't know if you know, they had a permit. The other group didn't have a permit. So I only tell you this. There are two sides to a story. I thought what took place was a horrible moment for our country, a horrible moment. But there are two sides to the country. Does anybody have a final? Does anybody have? You have an infrastructure.
What makes you think you can get an infrastructure bill? You didn't get health care.
Well, you know, I'll tell you. We came very close with health care. Unfortunately, John McCain decided to vote against it at the last minute. You'll have to ask John McCain why he did that. But we came very close to health care. We will end up getting health care. But we'll get the infrastructure, and actually infrastructure is something that I think will have bipartisan support on. I actually think Democrats will go along with the infrastructure.
President, have you spoken to the family? Have you spoken to the family of the victim of the car attack?
No, I'll be reaching out. When will you
be reaching out?
I was I thought that the statement put out, the mother's statement, I thought was a beautiful statement. I always tell you, it was something that I really appreciated. I thought it was terrific, and really under the kind of stress that she's under and the heartache that she's under, I thought putting out that statement to me was really something I won't forget. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Do you plan to go to Charlottesville?
President Trump at Trump Tower a short time ago, and what began as a news conference about infrastructure and an executive order he signed, and what evolved into an extremely animated debate and rather defense on the president's part of his decision to wait 2 days to condemn neo-Nazis in Charlottesville over the weekend. The president ultimately said, I think there's blame on both sides, saying that there were members of the left who came up who actually attacked members on the right and came and were violent. He called it a horrible moment for our country. But let's bring in Margaret Brennan, who is there at Trump Tower and who actually asked the question about Senator John McCain's remarks that seemed to set the president off. Margaret?
Well, Anthony, what you just saw was a president who has been needing to unload a lot of frustration. He has really felt and expressed that today, that coverage of that Unite the Right rally that included neo-Nazis, that included the KKK and some extremely violent groups, was unfairly characterized as being linked in some way to a tacit endorsement by him. But then he put himself in the morally and rhetorically difficult position here today of appearing to defend them and appearing to defend what he thought was unfair coverage of their cause, saying that all of this was really the result of something that was a dispute over the removal of a statue of Robert E. Lee. Of course, there are other goals and some very extreme goals backed by some of the groups who were at that rally both Friday and Saturday in Charlottesville. The president then off camera wandered over, talked to reporters further and mentioned when I asked repeatedly would he go to Charlottesville in an effort to try to heal some of these wounds that he's talked about, he said, oh, I know Charlottesville well. In fact, I own a property there. I own a vineyard. Talked about it as a very nice place. But really what you saw, that anger that was sparked there, had to do with the question I asked about what the president's response was to Senator John McCain, who has asked and publicly called for the president to defend some of his own staff, his National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster, against attacks from those linked to the alt-right. And the president then turned that into a debate about just what alt-right meant and whether that in some way equated to those who are on the extreme left. Of course, the difficulty in that is the connection to the neo-Nazis and the KKK who were at that rally, and that's where the conversation really sort of got off the rails, very far from the infrastructure topic that you said we were here to talk about. And in fact, I want to say to you, Anthony, just moments ago, you saw the Secretary of Transportation, you saw the head of the Economic Council, you saw the Secretary of the Treasury and other top officials in the administration standing there very awkwardly around the president because they were there to talk about the president's agenda and take questions about that. And all the questions that they got from us here were about what the president had just said and whether that made their agenda more difficult and whether the business community felt alienated, because you have seen some of these business leaders, at least four, step away, say they don't feel comfortable working with the president on some of his agenda items. And in fact, you saw the Transportation Secretary Elaine Chao, who is married to Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader who has been the subject of many Twitter attacks recently from the president due to his frustration over health care. Elaine Chao was asked, what about the president's attacks on your president, verbally? And she said, she quipped, really, well, I stand by my men, both of them, saying that she stands by her husband and she's standing right beside the president in what is unquestionably a very awkward position to be put in.
Most aspects of this news conference were pretty awkward for a lot of people, Margaret. The president was asked specifically about Steve Bannon, who has connections to the alt-right and worked for Breitbart. He offered kind of a tepid defense of Steve Bannon, did he not? His advisor?
He did. He did, very much so. That phrase, we'll see, is something you often hear President Trump use when he's considering whether or not to stand by a position. And we do know, as our Major Garrett has reported in recent days, Chief Strategist Steve Bannon has been on the razor's edge here, whether he stays or whether he goes from this Trump administration. As you say, he does have a past history working with Breitbart, which has been a platform for the alt-right. Steve Bannon has described it as such. That has added heat to what were already simmering tensions between him and other advisors, like the one I mentioned earlier, National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster. So the president did not say he had confidence in Steve Bannon, did not say whether he was staying or going, but made clear his future is uncertain.
The president also weighed in somewhat on the whole issue of the history of the Confederacy, particularly relating to the statue of Robert E. Lee, which he pointed out was at the center of this whole rally this weekend, and that people had objections to it being brought down. He said, is it George Washington next week? You really have to ask yourself, where does it stop? And he pointed out that George Washington was a slave owner.
Right. Well, on the facts, that is correct, as was Thomas Jefferson, who he also pointed to as a slave owner. However, what the president waded into there is something that is a difficult issue and being debated at the local level in many states and many cities about whether having symbols of the Confederacy is somehow a continued reminder or endorsement of some of the principles of the Confederate states who backed slavery. So he again waded into an issue he really didn't need to. He could have left it very simply at that is up to states and municipalities, but by going where he did with his rhetoric, really it seemed like Anthony standing here responding from a place of anger and frustration, that he put his thumb on the scale of that debate as well. And some of what he said here will be heard differently by people who are more sympathetic to perhaps that point of view, and perhaps a point of view that he described as the unfairly maligned alt-right at times.
Mm-hmm. All right, Margaret Brennan at Trump Tower, as we say, after an extraordinary news conference that began as a signing of an executive order on infrastructure spending, but evolved into a very animated defense of the president's statements over the weekend. There will be much more about this extraordinary day on your local news on this CBS station and on our 24-hour streaming news service, CBSN, and of course right here tonight on the CBS Evening News. Till then, I'm Anthony Mason, CBS News, New York.
For news 24 hours a day, go to CBSNews.com.